We're going to get started, I think. Thank you
Good.
so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm Tejal Patel. I'm the Executive Director of the SOC Investment Group. I'll be moderating today's discussion covering the Starbucks strikes and what investors need to know about it. We're so pleased to have with us today New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, Professor Thomas Kochen from the MIT Sloan School of Management, Jonas Krohn from Trillium Asset Management, and a Starbucks barista and member of the bargaining committee, Jasmine Laley. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to kind of lay out the background on what has been a pretty prolonged process to achieve a fair collective bargaining agreement at Starbucks. For the past 4 years, Starbucks baristas, starting in Buffalo, New York, and then spreading nationwide, have been organizing unions at Starbucks stores. And since 2024, these workers have been negotiating with company management for a first collective bargaining agreement that would cover workers at more than 600 stores across the country. The road has been rocky. The company responded to workers' organizing efforts with a very aggressive anti-union campaign, which made Starbucks one of the biggest violators of labor law in modern history. The National Labor Relations Board administrative law judges have found that Starbucks committed more than 400 labor law violations over the course of more than 3 years. And these actions drew ire from customers, elected officials, investors, and appears to have negatively impacted Starbucks' reputation. So some of you may recall that Starbucks' aggressive response to its baristas' organizing efforts prompted engagement by shareholders. This included a first of its kind majority supported labor rights assessment in 2023, which was proposed by the Comptroller's Office and Trillium Asset Management, as well as others. It also included the nomination of 3 directors to Starbucks' board as part of a proxy contest that we launched at the SOC back in 2024. And in March of 2024, Starbucks and the union agreed to a framework for collective bargaining for a first contract for unionized workers. Following that announcement, we withdrew our nominees. We were cautiously optimistic, I think, that Starbucks could return to its roots of being an enlightened employer that was able to really leverage this reputation to help attract and retain its workers while maintaining high levels of customer satisfaction. And for many months, there were signs that productive negotiations were in fact taking place. So the union and the company reached agreements on most of the provisions of the contract. They were meeting monthly and in person. Unfortunately, since Starbucks has hired its new CEO in the fall of 2024, the talks appear to have stalled. And since January of this year, 125 new unfair labor practices charges, these are known as ULPs, have been filed. There was also mediation attempts earlier this year that were not successful. And there remains really just a few essential unsettled areas that need to get an agreement. So that is pay, scheduling, and resolving these outstanding ULP charges. And all of this has been happening while Starbucks' performance has been steadily declining by various metrics, including profitability and EPS, according to the latest earnings reports. So, with union baristas now going on into the fourth year of attempting to reach a final collective bargaining agreement, on November 13th, over 1,000 union baristas launched an open-ended ULP strike, protesting more than 700 unresolved ULP charges and demanding a fair first contract. In light of these strikes, we thought it was a good time to help this audience kind of understand a little bit about why the baristas are striking, how investors have been engaging with Starbucks on these ongoing labor rights issues, and why from a workforce management perspective, reaching a fair contract quickly will benefit Starbucks, its baristas, and Starbucks investors. So, with all this background in mind, I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, whose office manages over 300 billion in assets under management across 5 New York City retirement systems. Along with Trillium Asset Management and other investors, he recently sent a letter to Starbucks' board expressing concern over the stalled negotiations between the company and unionized employees represented by Starbucks Workers United. Thank you so much for joining us, Comptroller Lander. Could you please tell us a little bit about your concerns at Starbucks?
Thanks so much, Tejal. An honor to be on with you and with Jonas, our partner in a lot of the shareholder action, and of course with Jasmine, and the workers that are doing the organizing and Workers United. So thank you, Tom and Daisy and Jasmine and Jonas and Tejal. Let's start with the reality that long-term Starbucks shareholders like us can't ignore whether Starbucks management welcomes it or not. More than 11,000 of its workers have a union. What they don't have is a contract. And that creates a dynamic that is not good for the company. In the absence of that contract, 4 years after the first successful union election in Buffalo, the company's approach to labor relations poses significant and growing risks for the company's long-term prosperity, for its shareholders. Successful turnarounds are not built on a foundation of entrenched labor management conflict. And that's where we are right now. We're seeing the consequences of the company's approach to not respecting the freedom of association and collective bargaining of its workers, even though that's part of its own human rights policies and the prolonged inaction. We're seeing those consequences in the nationwide strike that's underway right now, and especially for a company whose brand and business model are on the idea of partnership, of having customers feel good in the stores, of workforce stability. The state of labor relations here poses operational, legal, and reputational risks to the company that are troubling to shareholders. Here in New York City, just this week, Starbucks agreed to pay $35 million to more than 15,000 workers in what we believe is the largest worker protection settlement in New York City after the company denied thousands of workers stable schedules and cut their hours arbitrarily. Now, this one is especially close to me because that's my law. I was the sponsor of the Fair Workweek law when I was a New York City council member, and many other companies comply with it. McDonald's complies with it. The fast food restaurants in the city all have to comply. Starbucks knows they have to comply. And yet there were reportedly more than 500,000 violations over a 3-year period. And that's the law, you know. So workers who aren't covered by New York City's fair scheduling law, who are demanding fairer scheduling in their contract, are just trying not to have erratic hours, shifts that get added and changed, having to close at night and open in the morning, not being able to get a pathway to full-time work. All those things are laws in New York City. And of course, workers want to bargain for them. And yet the company is not bargaining in good faith around them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that on Monday, when that settlement was announced, Starbucks share price fell by 2.5%, much more than the S&P. I think workers are concerned about that. I mean, I know workers are concerned about it. Investors are clearly concerned as well. And it's exactly the kind of issue that's supposed to be addressed through collective bargaining. That's the purpose. Look, we've been concerned about labor relations for a while. We've actually met with the last 3 CEOs, with Kevin Johnson, with Lakshman Narasimhan, and most recently with Brian Niccol. And as Tejal said, we were hopeful that there was going to start being some change, right? Before 2021, when those first workers voted in Buffalo, maybe there wasn't a reason for concern, but those employees started organizing, Jasmine and her colleagues, and it was clear something needed to change. But then instead of that, we heard hundreds of unfair labor practices. And so investors stepped up to urge the company, in our responsibility as shareholders and with the board members who represent us on the board, to respect its workers' fundamental rights to organize and bargain collectively, consistent with Starbucks' own human rights commitments and its mission to build a bridge to a better future for its employees. So in 2023, we joined together with Jonas and Trillium and other investors to file a shareholder proposal calling for an independent assessment of Starbucks' adherence to, again, its own policies on workers' rights. And this was really unprecedented. 52% of shareholders supported the proposal. Nothing like that has happened in corporate America, where a majority of investors said, we're concerned that the company's human rights policies in relationship to its workers aren't being followed. The board commissioned that assessment, which urged Starbucks to redouble efforts to engage with workers and ensure meaningful bargaining. The board created a dedicated committee to oversee labor relations. We met again, and we understood that the company was trying hard to reach a contract with its union employees. And yet all we've seen over the last year is backtracking. There was a brief period of time under the new CEO where it seemed like maybe things were going to move forward. and now they just seem to be digging in. Well, just one more thing I'll say is, in that moment of hope, of more optimism, they said they're bargaining with Workers United to try to reach agreement. Brian Nickel himself publicly stated that he was committed to making sure that Starbucks engages constructively and in good faith with the union, and that's what investors were relying on. Well, all that has changed is that tone at the top. You can't hear it. Management now sticks to a mantra that it is stands ready to return to the table, but that's just a way of saying we are stalling bargaining. So shortly, we're going to hear from Jasmine, who will tell us all about the company's response or the lack thereof. But this is clear. There's those 11,000 workers. They've been without a contract for 4 years, even though the issues they're talking about, you can see they're real because New York City ruled, that Starbucks has to pay $3 million for violating exactly the kind of issue that workers are just asking for a fair and reasonable contract for. So, what investors like to have are companies where the management and labor are aligned, where you're living up to your policies, advancing the brand, and having a company that's thriving for everyone. That's how you get a company that's thriving for shareholders. And we're going to keep pushing until we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comptroller Lander, and thank you for all of the work that you've done the last few years on this particular issue. So Trillium Asset Management has also signed on to the investor letter expressing concerns over Starbucks' labor negotiations. We have Chief Advocacy Officer at Trillium, Jonas Krohn, with us today. Jonas, could you speak a little bit about Trillium's perspective on the ongoing labor disputes at Starbucks?
Sure. Thank you, Tejal. And it's really wonderful to be here. I think where I'm actually going to start is with a document that the controller and SOC and other investors put together earlier this year, which was a set of principles on collective bargaining. And the reason we put out those principles were because we believe that a strong relationship with unions, between workers and management, is consistent with a sustainable, profitable long-term strategy, and importantly, are consistent with the fundamental human rights that underpin our economy. In contrast, labor disputes can pose financial, legal, and reputational risks that ultimately harm shareholder value. So, as you can see on the screen, these are the principles that we put together. And the principles themselves are based on the idea that companies should commit to bargaining with the genuine goal of reaching mutually acceptable agreements expeditiously. And I think that word here is particularly important given the 4 years since the first stores voted to unionize. To achieve this, the process should adhere to these four key principles that you see. The first is focused on timeliness. Collective bargaining commences and proceeds towards a mutually acceptable agreement without unjustified delays. A structured process. Parties establish a collective bargaining procedures and ground rules for bargaining that support consistent advancement toward an agreement, and that the process should include regularly scheduled bargaining sessions and include representatives who have the authority to bind the parties present at these sessions. High quality information. Parties should be providing each other with information that facilitates meaningful and intelligent bargaining. And then lastly, a genuine back and forth. Parties need to consider each other's proposals and strive to identify acceptable solutions and overcome barriers to reaching an agreement. And so that's going to mean, timely exchange of proposals and responsive counter proposals. Now, I realize these may feel a little abstract on the page like this, but I really want to emphasize that these are not abstract ideals. These are actually practical steps that we believe can reduce risk and create value. And as such, I want to really urge the folks in the audience to keep these in mind when you hear from Jasmine shortly, and she talks about what is actually happening. So another point I want to touch on here at the beginning is that I think there's a persistent, pernicious myth out there that unions harm productivity. And I think, however, that the evidence says otherwise. As Trillium has documented in a number of different reports, research shows that collective bargaining agreements often improve health and safety performance, reduce turnover, and importantly for our purposes today, foster better communication between workers and management. From our perspective, freedom of association and collective bargaining can create structures that identify and mitigate a number of risks, and that stands to benefit the business, the workers, and shareholders. Now, you're going to hear more about this from Professor Koken in a little bit, but that unions, I want to talk here a little bit about how unions can be linked to high performance work systems, teamwork, problem solving, flexibility, innovative practices. And all of those are things that really can benefit Starbucks today. These are systems that can incentivize employees for contributing ideas that improve operations. And in short, unions are not the drag on performance that too many people assume. They can be an important lever for improvement, and especially if management engages with them in a productive manner. So this gets me to Starbucks. Because the challenges that Starbucks faces today could be addressed with a good working relationship with its union. Starbucks faces the same headwinds as the entire restaurant industry: lower demand, inflationary pressures, and importantly, shifting consumer behavior. These are very real challenges, and Starbucks is going to need to outperform in a very specific area to be successful. CEO Brian Niccol has a turnaround plan. He calls it Back to Starbucks. And that plan clearly sees those challenges. But importantly, it is leaning in to the fact that it needs to rebuild the customer experience. He's put it this way, that Starbucks needs to succeed by being a, quote, world-class customer service company. And to do that, the company could benefit from reaching this first contract. Failing to reach our first contract with unionized workers is at best unhelpful and more likely a severe headwind, as Starbucks Workers United has proven to be very resilient and successful. Despite the lack of a first contract, it's important to note that stores continue to vote for the union. The union is growing, it's not shrinking. So from my perspective, including my earlier points and the points that you're going to be hearing from co-panelists, resolving this dispute with the union would accelerate progress towards Niccol's goals, because management and the union already agree on one very critical point. Customers are not satisfied. Service times are too long, stores feel understaffed, and the personal connection that defined the Starbucks experience has weakened. Both sides recognize that this is unsustainable. This shared understanding is an opportunity. Instead of seeing the union as an adversary, management can see it as a partner in fixing the customer experience. Going back to my earlier points, unions can be linked to high performance work systems, teamwork, problem solving, flexibility, innovative practices. A first contract would do more than resolve this dispute. It would actually be an important way to signal to workers and customers that Starbucks is serious about creating a stable, motivated workforce. When workers feel respected in their decision to form a union and secure in having reached a contract, they can deliver better service and be better partners with management. Better service can lead to happier customers. Happier customers can drive growth, even in a challenging environment like what we have right now. And so working with the union is not to be seen as a concession. It's actually a strategic move, one that could benefit the company's reputation rather than being a detractor. Collaboration with the union offers the promise of stabilizing operations, improving morale, restoring the customer experience that can drive loyalty and growth. But it can also be a source of ideas for operational improvements that the union can facilitate. In short, resolving the situation is not just about labor relations, it's about delivering on the promise of world-class service, that key language that Niccol has been talking about. So I think the question is pretty straightforward. Is Starbucks leadership going to seize the chance to work with the union and find a successful solution to a problem they both agree on? That was essentially the promise Starbucks made in February 2024 that Tejal was discussing at the top, when the company and Workers United found a pathway forward. Now is the time to realize that promise. So to close, from where I sit, Starbucks has a choice. Keep going down this path that could undermine the turnaround strategy, or embrace a long-term positive relationship with an energized union that can strengthen the company brand, improve customer experience, and drive sustainable growth. And I think with that, I'll turn it back to you, Tejal.
Thanks, Jonas. And thanks for highlighting, I think, that the commonality that's there between the turnaround plan, what Brian Nichols' objectives are with improving customer service, and what the baristas are trying to do, which is really the same thing. And to talk a little bit about that, actually, we're going to talk to Jasmine next. So Jasmine Laley is a Starbucks Workers United barista in Buffalo, New York, someone who has sat across the bargaining table from Starbucks since the onset of the negotiations. Jasmine, could you speak a little bit as to why you and your colleagues at Starbucks have found it necessary to strike?
Thank you, Tejal, Comptroller, Lander, and Jonas. And thank you, investors. As Tejal said, my name is Jasmine Lally. I've been a union barista at the Buffalo Starbucks in Buffalo for 4 years now. I'm also an elected bargaining delegate and strike captain at my store. I love my job. I have made so many relationships with my coworkers and my regulars. I know their orders, a little bit about their life. It's one of my favorite parts about working at Starbucks. And I have faith in what Starbucks can be. But right now, our jobs are a lot harder. We're dealing with understaffing, bad corporate leadership, and an array of new policies that don't actually help us make the drinks any faster or get the customers on their way to where they need to be any faster. Thousands of my coworkers at over 120 stores across the country are on an unfair labor practice strike because Starbucks refuses to listen to baristas like me about what's going on in our stores and resolve unfair labor practices. So I'm here to tell you how we got here and what Starbucks isn't telling you. Bargaining for a national framework agreement for union stores and baristas began in April of 2024. It was a really cool experience to put together these proposals with hundreds of baristas across the country. Under then CEO Lakshman Narasimham in 2024, we met with the company and we bargained for 8 months. We reached 33 tentative agreements about a variety of issues that we face at work, agreements that would codify common sense solutions and that would improve our workplace. In September of 2024, the union presented an initial set of economic proposals for negotiation to increase our pay and our benefits. Starbucks flat out rejected those proposals and in exchange put forth a really unserious economic package that didn't raise our wages in the first year of the contract, nor did it address the core issues of hours and staffing. So for the next few months of bargaining, we met via federal mediation, and the company refused to make significant movement on those issues. We overwhelmingly rejected their offer in April and have been clear and consistent in demanding Starbucks offer new proposals. We need an increase in our hours and staffing, a raise in pay, and a resolve to hundreds of the unfair labor practice charges. Since April, it's been about 6 months, and Starbucks is stonewalling us, and we're fed up. We're fed up with the union busting and the failure to finalize this fair contract. And so we've had to take action. So currently 2,500 union baristas from over 120 stores across 80 cities are on an open-ended unfair labor practice strike. Many thousands are waiting in the wings to join us in the upcoming weeks if that's necessary. We also have 125,000 supporters that have signed our no contract, no coffee pledge to stand with union baristas to not buy Starbucks while we're on strike. Today is day 21 of the Red Cup Rebellion, a national unfair labor practice strike that has become the longest ULP strike in Starbucks history so far. So now that we're here, let's get to the truth and see through all of the smoke and mirrors and the spin that Starbucks is telling you. First, Brian Nickel became the CEO in September of 2024, and we were excited to continue bargaining this framework with the company. And he said, I'm committed to making sure we engage constructively and in good faith with the union and the partners it represents. The fact is, Starbucks has returned to aggressive union busting campaign and racked up a historic number of labor violations. Over the past year, Workers United has filed over 125 ULP charges, including national charges over bad faith bargaining and unilateral policy changes, and specific charges around retaliatory firings and discipline. Next, Starbucks keeps saying the union walked away from negotiations and that they're ready to talk. The reality is, Starbucks' failure to meaningfully engage on economics led to our talks breaking down. Going to the bargaining table is pointless at this point. without a commitment from Starbucks to offer new proposals that address our demands to increase our hours, our staffing, our pay, and resolving unfair labor practice charges. Third, Starbucks has been making this claim that union baristas propose pay increases of 65% immediately and 77% over 3 years in negotiations last year. That's not true. It has never been true, and it's an egregious misrepresentation of what we actually proposed. Last September, we proposed a set of options for negotiation to improve wages and benefits. They presented, they were presented with a menu of options starting, it's basically a starting point. And as was the process for all other aspects of the framework, bargaining to date. Starbucks is disingenuously adding all of the individual ideas together and presenting it as one so-called demand. Think of it as walking into Starbucks and looking at the entire menu and saying, a drink costs $1,000. You shouldn't believe this spin. And lastly, Starbucks says they offer the best job in retail with $30 an hour, including benefits like healthcare, tuition, and reimbursement. The reality is, we're actually fighting to make Starbucks better, which is why we put so much time into this contract. Right now, baristas can't make ends meet. The average barista doesn't make a livable wage. They often have to make the decision between paying a utility bill or putting gas on their car to make it to work, or even being able to afford food. Starting wages are less than $16 an hour in 43 states. A lot of our baristas are on Medicaid or receive SNAP benefits because we just don't make enough to survive. That paycheck that we have coming this week is already spent to put gas in our car and food on the table. Baristas are not getting the full hours that they request. It's fully in management's hands how many hours you get. So the average barista gets about 19 hours a week. You need 20 hours a week to access those benefits. So that's a lot of spin and lies and deception that's been told by Starbucks. So where does that leave us? The executives are fighting us. The baristas who fuel their profits, the ones that keep the customers coming back, the people that know your order, and the people that you come to see every morning over their multi-year contract that would cost less than $80 million to finalize. What does that mean? That's less than a day's average sales for Starbucks. It's less than the pay that Brian Nicholas received. It's less than the $81 million that management received at a lavish concert experience in Vegas last year. We're ready to do whatever it takes to end the union busting, resolve unfair labor practices, and finally settle a fair contract. We need Starbucks to come back to the table with meaningful proposals to finish this. The ball is in their court to deliver so we can finally find labor peace and work together at building a better Starbucks. And with that, Tejal, I will give it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for your comments. I think they really provide a fuller picture of the bargaining process and kind of what prompted the strikes. So as a reminder, we're going to be going into a Q&A session in a few minutes. You can go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than raising your hands. And we'll get to them when we can after the last speaker. And speaking of our final speaker, last but certainly not least, we're going to be hearing from Professor Thomas Coken, who specializes in employment policies and practices. Professor Coken, can you tell us a little bit about how you would evaluate the ongoing labor dispute at Starbucks and what risks the company takes by not working with the union, and what opportunities there are with finalizing a collective bargaining agreement?
Sure. Thank you, Jill, and my fellow panelists. You've really laid out what all of our research over the last several decades demonstrates. And so let me just summarize that. And then I want to end my remarks with a strong proposal for how we can get this contract settled and do all of the good work that Jasmine mentioned in terms of building a high quality relationship with working with management. The first point is there's an enormous amount of research showing that customer satisfaction depends on worker satisfaction. They go together. And when customers are dissatisfied, they are frustrated, and that makes the job of the baristas and so on more harder. And when workers are dissatisfied and can't put food on the table or are getting their hours cut, then that's going to carry over, and customers are going to be dissatisfied. Resolving this dispute is the first step to building a positive relationship where the employees, the baristas, are the ambassador for the company again, as they have been in the past, and building a strong positive relationship that then does help to drive productivity. The second point is, as the comptroller mentioned, there's clear reputational costs to the company. And it provided some evidence of that when the fine in New York City is announced, the share price goes down. Over the past period of bargaining, as they have stopped bargaining, the share price is going down. The evidence is that a long strike is the most harmful uh, uh, indicator of a company in trouble, and the shareholders respond accordingly, and the price of the stock is not going to go up until this contract is resolved. The third point, and Jasmine made this so clearly, and Jonas summarized a lot of the evidence. We know that it's not just a union that influences the presence of a union, whether it has productivity, benefits, or costs. It's the quality of the relationship. When the company really works with the union to engage the workers, to get their ideas for improving operational efficiencies, to working to ways to improve customer service, to getting the workers really motivated and see that they are being treated fairly and that they can be the ambassadors for the company in dealing with their customers. That's when we see the positive productivity effects. And so we've got to get to a point where the employees feel they are treated as partners so that they can behave as partners and so that they can help produce the turnaround that is part of Starbucks' stated strategy. So that's critical to implementing and achieving the return or back to Starbucks strategy that's been announced. The fourth point is that regardless of whether this strike is resolved, regardless if this goes on for another year or 2 years, these demands from employees for more of a voice at work are not going to go away. Why do we know that? All of our research shows that this is going on among young workers across the country. Young workers want a voice at work. They don't want to hate their employer. They don't. They aren't negative about their employers. Just do something I should have done. Uh, they're 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 interested in working together with employers. And it's very clear that when they do work together, they have greater voice, they have greater ideas, they work with each other more productively, and everyone benefits. But you have to build that quality relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. And so the final point on the research is that management has to really invest, the company has to invest in training its executives from the top right down to the store managers and the assistant managers, right down to every store in the system on how to manage in a unionized environment, how to draw on the knowledge and experience and energy of the workforce, how to work with a collective group. That's probably the most underdeveloped skill in American management across the country today. And if Starbucks wants to really get the benefits of this relationship, it's going to have to invest in developing a management culture and management skills to really bring the best out of its employees. Now, that's what all the evidence and all of the testimony that you just heard tells us. But how do we go from here? Well, I've been in this situation many times before. I do mediation. I try to maintain my acceptability to business leaders and to unions because that's what I do. And in settings like this, where you've had a strike, where you've had extended impasse in negotiations, where you've tried mediation and it hasn't worked, you have to do something stronger. And in other situations like this, including ones close to home for Starbucks in Seattle, where the Swedish hospital, their largest non-profit hospital, several years ago was in that situation. The governor asked me to come in as a special mediator, as a fact finder, to go in and find out what are the issues, get the parties to really talk to each other, work with a labor and management representative in what's called a tripartite process, and try to resolve it. And if you can't resolve it, then the governor said, write me a report that says here's where the parties have agreed, here's where they haven't, and I will issue that report to the public. That's what we need in this case. We need to make the proposals transparent to the public, hopefully with a skilled process like that, adding more pressure to both parties to be realistic in their demands, to find that common ground, to work with a neutral and with other parties who have some power, because there's perhaps the leverage of the comptroller of the city of New York and his counterparts around the country, and the pressures from you as investors to say, get this resolved. And if you don't get it resolved, then I'm going to make this public, and we're going to make it clear that this is costing our state, our cities, our investment funds considerable money. I believe that kind of process, with the right public pressure and the right leadership from political leaders who have a big stake in this, would lead to a settlement. And then the good work that has been described here could take place and could move forward. So there's evidence that good work will improve company performance and improve the lives of the baristas. There's evidence that these issues aren't going to go away, regardless of whether there's a settlement. It's going to continue to be workers demanding and are thirsty for more of a voice to build their partnership. It's clear that there are options for getting it done, and it's time now to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cook, and thank you to all of our speakers. So we now have a few minutes for some questions to our panelists. Again, if you have questions, use the Q&A function rather than raising your hands. We are fortunate to have with us on the webinar during the Q&A portion, Daisy Pitkin, who's the Vice President of Workers United SEIU and Director of the Starbucks Workers United Bargaining Committee. Daisy's been deeply involved with the Starbucks workers organizing and collective bargaining efforts since they began 4 years ago. So I think the first question might make sense to actually go to Daisy and maybe Jasmine if she's comfortable with it. Um, could you talk a little bit about how, so CEO Brian Nickel recently said he's happy to negotiate, right? So from your perspective, why have the negotiations fallen apart? Where is this disconnect between kind of open-mindedness and lack of follow-through sort of happening?
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for such an enlightening panel this morning. I'm really such thoughtful remarks about the state of play and the current moment of this, campaign to win a first fair contract. But to this specific question, I think what Brian Nickel means when he says he's happy to negotiate is that he is happy to send the corporate delegation back to the bargaining table to present the same fixed position that they have been bargaining from since September of 2024. They're happy to tell us the same thing that they've been telling us for many, many months, which is that they are not interested in making improvements to wages or to benefits or to scheduling or to staffing levels inside the store. And you can only hear the same thing so many times, month after month, until negotiations we're not actually making any progress. So what baristas have said is that we can't accept that answer. And they, by a margin of 82%, voted down that package from the company, which did not offer any improvements to wages or to staffing levels or 2 hours and stable scheduling. And that we want the company to come back to the table with new proposals that address the very real problems that baristas face inside their stores. So that's where the breakdown has happened.
Thanks, Daisy. That's really helpful. Maybe the next question, Jasmine, if you're okay with answering this, but I think it might actually, there might be perspectives for everybody, so feel free to jump in. So Daisy, there's a question here that the person has heard from the CEO of a different fast food company that using automation technology actually helps with kind of the onslaught of orders and decreases employee turnover. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think you were kind of headed to Jasmine and then you
Oh,
said
I'm
Megan.
sorry.
So
Did I say
I'll say it from
them?
my perspective and
Sure.
Jasmine, please, from real life perspective inside the store. But I get to talk to baristas all across the country. We represent nearly 12,000 baristas at this point. And the issue with the queuing system is that, you know, technology can help kind of parse or do the triage of all of the drink and food orders coming in from the mobile ordering and pickup delivery systems. What it cannot address is the in-store traffic. And it can't comprehend or see or judge the in-store traffic. So what baristas have asked for in a collective bargaining agreement is the ability to pause mobile ordering if you have an in-person line of customers out the store and around the block. We'd like to be able to pause it so we can catch up on the in-person portion of it for 20 minutes, turn it back on to be able to deal with both. The problem is when you have 34 espresso orders, 27 food orders, multiple other things, plus a line of in-person angry customers who need to get to work and they're waiting for their drink. It's hard to balance those things, especially if you only have 2 or 3 people behind the counter trying to do it all.
Could I just build on that? Because we're doing a lot of research on how you bring worker voice into artificial intelligence and other technologies. The evidence again is clear. If you just have a top-down technology imposed, tell the workers this is the way it's going to be, now learn how to use it, it fails. Doesn't fail completely. It may have some benefits, but it misses the opportunity for workers to give wisdom to that technology, as the Japanese saying goes. And where workers have a voice in saying, here's the problems we have, just as Daisy said, and they get involved in the design and implementation of that technology earlier, then it has the kind of productivity and customer service benefits, and it's better accepted and more satisfied workforce. What we need is a joint committee coming out of these negotiations on technology to work to make these technologies really work for the customer and for the workforce. And then you will get the benefits of whatever is implemented. Without it, you'll spend a lot of money, as companies do, and wasted money because they find the technology doesn't work, because they don't understand how workers actually do their jobs. That's the key. And we've got strong evidence of that. I'm mediating a food service company right now on that issue, and we are going to have a breakthrough agreement on it on how to do this together.
I might also just make an additional comment here is that, I think the question was that a CEO from a different fast food restaurant was making that point. And I think that's actually a really important thing to differentiate here is that Starbucks, by its own account, is not trying to do what everybody else is doing. They are trying to, they're trying to provide a value. They're trying to provide a service. They're trying to provide customer service that other restaurants aren't trying to do. They're really leaning into that customer experience. They're not leaning into automation and just trying to get people out the door. They're trying to recreate that space as a space that people want to be. And I think that's a really important differentiator for Starbucks and what they're trying to do. And again, really underscores that the union and management is trying to achieve, I think, very much the same thing. I don't think there's a disagreement about the problem. And I think they're both in a position to create a sustainable solution going forward. So while other restaurants may be leaning more into the automation question, that's not really the plan for Starbucks.
Thanks, Jonas. So we've got a lot of really good questions coming in, which is great because we've got some time for them. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order because Professor Kogan actually kind of touched on this sort of novel idea on encouraging worker voice. One of the questions that we got is, it's clear that there is a disconnect and breakdown in communication between management and the workforce. There are a number of mechanisms that promote worker voice and encourage workforce engagement. One mechanism, which is underutilized in the US and more commonly used in Europe, is workforce directors at the board level. Workers have a voice in decision making and become more engaged as a result. Professor Kogan, maybe you can talk a little bit about it, but also Comptroller Lander and Jonas. Um, you does this panel see this as a model of something that Starbucks should consider to prevent workforce issues in the future once the contract is hopefully resolved?
Well, I think it's a very, very good question. And there's no single model for worker voice, as the questioner suggested. Board membership is one option that was proposed. The company said no, but uh, we could come back to that. There now is a committee of the board that is supposed to be providing leadership on these labor and employee processes and to be monitoring how the company is doing. That is a vehicle for workers to bring their ideas to that committee and to work with that committee to bring it to the rest of the board. That's an option. There's councils that could be put together across stores and within stores. Within stores, there's no substitute for having listening to the workers, providing opportunities for teams to bubble up ideas. So we start at the workplace, bubbling up ideas that work for the particular store. The regional managers and a regional committee look at what's working in those good stores and they say, how can we do it together in others? And then the board has to oversee all of this so that they say, gee, this is really providing some new approaches, and we need to talk about it at our level, and we need to have our union leaders come and talk to us about it. So even if they're not ready for formal representation on the board, which we have in Europe and Germany, and it works just fine, there are mechanisms to get these ideas filtered up through the workforce, through the union, to the board, so that the resources can be provided to make it all work.
Thank you so much. Jonas, did you have
I,
something? I go off
I
mute.
just might add, I was just trying to find this really quickly. There was a recent study, survey of corporate directors in the United States. And the interesting thing about it is that most corporate directors think there's at least one or two members of their co-directors on on those boards that are actually not qualified to be there. I think there's actually a fair amount of dissatisfaction with the leadership quality at boards. So without speaking necessarily to any individual board member at Starbucks, I think there should be a lot more openness to bringing workers onto these boards. I think there is a real need for those insights and those and that perspective on the board of directors. And I think the directors are starting more broadly, writ large, are starting to see some dissatisfaction with sort of constructing boards in the same old way that we've always constructed them.
Great.
One
Oh,
thing I'll just add here is that, so the resolution proposed that we brought as shareholders a couple of years ago proposed a genuinely independent review. And they did it not fully independent. The big thing we pushed was for them to talk to workers. And they refused to talk to workers as part of that, as though somehow that would like violate the sanctity of the investigation, when of course you would talk to workers and say, we're doing an assessment independently on the company's relationship to its workers in how it does bargaining. So I just think it speaks to, and actually, back when we met with Lakshman Narasimhan, it was really clear. He's like, we've got our thoughts about how we do our work, our relationships with our workers in one place, and we just view the union negotiations as adversarial, and there's no place that we're interested in having a dialogue that includes worker voice in thinking about what corporate, workplace management policies should be. And there's a lot of better ways to do that. I mean, obviously, for now, it's go negotiate in good faith and get a contract. But making that committee real, thinking about constructive ways to engage with workers on exactly the kinds of questions you guys are presenting today, many of which wind up in a contract, of course, but some of which are in how you do your business and choose your technology and structure the processes that aren't necessarily in a CBA, but are a great place for labor management collaboration to improve the efficiency of the company. And yes, it would be wonderful if Starbucks, after entering, getting a good CBA, would decide, instead of how it's been acting, to be a model for American companies. And the idea of partnership for doing that, whether that's with this board committee or, with worker representation on the board, or, who knows, there's plenty of structures for doing it if you want to do it.
I do want to just briefly mention that you, I think this concept of workers having a voice inside the board space is not totally alien to Starbucks. They have a practice that Howard Schultz has spoken about over the years, and then again recently in a blog post, that at board meetings they keep an empty chair at the board meetings to symbolize the voice of workers inside the stores, because they believe that the voice of workers is important. But of course, that chair is empty and there's no one sitting there actually voicing into the room the concerns of workers. So part of the campaign from the beginning 4 years ago, was about actually putting a voice into that space instead of an empty chair.
And the evidence on this about board membership, worker representatives on boards in the United States and in Germany and in other places, is that when those representatives bring information from the workforce itself, it expands the agenda of issues that most boards spend 95% of their time on. And the board members then learn about worker labor management relations. They can ask the right questions. They can hold each other and the CEO and managers accountable. That's the value. It's not that the worker filling that chair or the workers that fill that chair are bring just a whole new dimension of their own personal expertise. They bring the voice that they of information and ideas that come from below. And to the extent that they have credible information on, here's what workers are saying, our problems, and here are our opportunities, the whole board can then make better decisions. And I've seen this in person, where the board really appreciates that kind of information because they can't get it any other way.
And just one thing, if I can just jump in here.
Sure.
While we were at bargaining, we actually did meet in subcommittees with the company and discuss issues like healthcare and staffing and scheduling, to give them our perspective of how things are actually working in the store and kind of like where the breakdown is. And they took a lot of notes and were very appreciative of that process. So it's very possible, and we would love to continue that relationship. It was very helpful and resourceful for all of us.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for jumping in on that question. I think that the next one I might pass to Jasmine, and we only have a few minutes left, so this might be like the second to last question. But so, Jasmine, Starbucks has implemented a couple big changes recently, between the closure of hundreds of stores, its back to Starbucks strategy. Can you talk a little bit more about the impacts of the changes on workers and what the workers are thinking of some of these changes? Like, are they considered positive in any way, on customer satisfaction, or is there a feeling that it's just increasing kind of the strain on the baristas?
I would say a lot of the policy changes that have come about have caused a lot of strain on baristas. The initial policy change of the dress code a lot of workers are beyond paycheck to paycheck. We need every dollar in our paycheck. And when the new dress code was rolled out, there was no grace given if you wore jeans that had, a ripped hem at the bottom, you were sent home. And it was at the beginning of your shift. And a lot of our workers take public transportation to work or rely on rideshare. So as I said, without an increase in pay, you're losing money for that shift and facing discipline over minor things like a discrepancy in like the color of tone of black shirt. A shift supervisor, for instance, at my store wore one of the shirts that Starbucks provided for the new wardrobe, and which is a black t-shirt with graphic on front. And my manager expressed to her that her shirt was out of dress code due to the faded color of black. Um, the policies that are rolled out is just, it's a lot for management to comprehend and for the baristas, and we're having to do it with less. Um, Quite frankly, the menu has not been simplified as was we were all excited for. And so customers have a lot more options to customize their drinks. All of those drinks are being made by baristas. And so we are essentially timed at putting those drinks together while also providing a service of making eye contact and connecting with customers. So you can imagine, yes, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but working a short staff shift, having customers that are waiting for their drinks because it's taking too long, staring at you and having that positive connection, it's a lot for baristas to juggle, which is why we address these issues in the contract, and would be better for all. But it's definitely been stressful in the stores with the understaffing. And then to the question about the hours, our management is in control of how many hours you work per week. So you could get hired at Starbucks and say, I want to work 40 hours per week. But if the labor available is maybe only 15 or 20 hours, that's what you're getting. And if you're falling short of making those benefit hours, then you don't get the healthcare that a lot of our partners are seek when they come to work at Starbucks.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm going to take moderator privilege and add 2 more minutes because this last question I think is an interesting one. So, for Brad and Jonas, what can I do as a shareholder of Starbucks to move the company towards a settlement agreement with the union?
Jonas, you want to go first and I'll follow you?
Sure. I think, what I would really encourage investors to be doing is contacting the company and asking them questions. Ask them questions based on the collective bargaining principles that we put up on the screen and we talked about at the beginning, and try to really express to them your perspective on the value of unions, the value of this union, and what it really means for helping the company move forward in its strategy. I think that kind of communication and contact with shareholders is vitally important.
Really agree. If you were one of the investors who voted for the resolution a couple years ago, you could say, hey, we don't usually do that kind of thing, but we value the brand of this company and the policies of this company. We don't feel like you're in alignment with it right now. We don't take that lightly. And I will just say, hearing from even a modest number of investors will make a big difference. So, this is that resolution did, and it had an impact at the moment. And if they hear just from, I think, even a handful of investors now, it'll really matter. So talk to your rep, reach out. You can do it by letter, you can do it by call, you can do it by email. It really will matter. One little thing, just to what Jasmine said, that I didn't mention this about the law here, but our Fair Workweek law in New York requires that when there's hours to give because, someone has left, they have to be offered to existing workers before you bring on new part-time workers. What a simple thing to do, right? Like you can't hire a new part-time worker, like offer a shift because some worker left to the folks you already have and help them get to benefits and full-time work. So there's so many ways to do this. And I just really want to say I respect so much what the workers are doing. I'm sorry it, has taken this long, but we are, proud as investors to be doing all we can to make sure the company lives up to its policies, and reaches a fair and strong agreement with you.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks for staying on a little bit extra. So that's all the time that we have. I know Daisy has been answering some of the questions in the chat, in the answered questions tab. If there are any unanswered questions that people want to try to get to any of our panelists, you're welcome to email them to us at info@socinvestmentgroup.com. We'll field them out, and hopefully you can get an answer to them. So just a reminder, there's going to be a recording available shortly to this, hopefully by tomorrow morning at the latest. And thank you all to our panelists and the participants for joining us today for this really thought-provoking discussion. We hope that it was helpful. Thanks so much.